By the end of World War II, the United States had lost over 400,000 lives and spent more than $4 trillion when adjusted for inflation. Now, over 50 years later, the United States could be on the verge of another war across the pond. The United States State Department has reported that the U.S. has spent $64.1 billion in military support in Ukraine. This is since Russia first invaded Ukraine back in February of 2022. This is just under $2 billion a month. This is just one example of how the U.S. has already gotten in too deep. The U.S. needs to get the country out of Ukraine as it is wasting taxpayers' money. It is putting the U.S. at risk of global confrontation and has already resulted in copious amounts of loss of life. According to Yahoo News, we live in a world where 8 out of 10 Americans are scared that World War III is a real threat. It should be the American government's job to do everything it can to protect Americans from this threat. First, we're going to look at how the war in Ukraine is risking global confrontation. Then we're going to transition into how the money from the taxpayers is being wasted. Finally, we're going to touch on how the war will and has already resulted in enormous loss of life. The war in Ukraine is already showing similarities to World War II. The New York Times quoted a Ukrainian soldier saying, "The current war is reminiscent of those early days in World War II. And if left unchecked, it could turn into something much bigger, something global." As a NATO ally, the Allegiance's Collective Defense Clause would make the U.S. legally obligated to defend its allies if the situation continues to escalate. The obligation would compel the United States to invest substantial military and economic resources and drag it into direct combat with Russia and other states, potentially leading to conflict on a global stage. Such involvement would not only put American lives at risk, but also take emergency U.S. resources away from essential domestic priorities and place the U.S. at perilous disadvantages on the world stage. We know that the ongoing war in Ukraine has been an enormous financial burden on U.S. taxpayers, and there's no end in sight. The U.S. has committed over $60 billion since Ukraine's invasion. This financial support is aimed at offsetting Russian aggression, but it also puts in a tremendous expenditure on the country as it battles its own domestic illnesses. For instance, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or the HUD, said that it would take about $20 billion a year to end homelessness. The U.S. is spending 1.5 times that amount in Ukraine a year, signaling that foreign conflicts are more important than attacking poverty and homelessness in the States. The apparent misallocation of taxpayer dollars in a faraway country is also a growing concern that U.S. tax dollars might be better focused on our domestic needs rather than spending them in a distant war whose outcome is uncertain. Finally, the war in Ukraine has already brought a high price to pay in Ukrainian soldiers and civilians' lives, and U.S. citizens' lives. By November of 2022, the U.S. Congress had already projected that around 200,000 troops from both Russia and Ukraine had either died or been wounded. The cost of the war in Ukraine in human life is just mind-boggling. The staggering figure isn't just the human cost in the war in Ukraine, it's also the risk of further escalation that could result in even more lives lost. At least 50 Americans have died already, and those loss of lives just reminds us of the sad and devastating effects the war will demand, and it makes the government, or it should make the government, rethink its part it plays in what's been going on. As I close today, I want to take a minute to recap some of my key points. We've seen that the war in Ukraine is not only putting American lives at risk, but it's also risking global confrontation and draining U.S. taxpayers' money. With the U.S. already having committed over $64 billion in military aid, that money could have been used to address pressing issues like homelessness and poverty here in the States. Furthermore, with the copious amounts of lives lost, it makes you think, well, what happens if America gets into this war? Who would be paying the ultimate price? In conclusion, the United States needs to reconsider their involvement in this war. The risk of global conflict, the misuse of taxpayers' money, the tragic loss of human life, they're far too high to ignore. The American government's primary priority should always be the safety and well-being of its people. And it's time to bring our focus back to protecting our nation and protecting our future. Thank you.